I'm Emma.
They brought sadly onto the rainbow bridge.
I have your book. Yeah, did let me probably read it.
Did you read it? Did you look at it?
Oh yeah, I loved it. Yeah, thank you for lending the book.
Can we bring this up?
Yes, I really appreciate
Hello, everyone. Hi. Hello. Thank you all so much for coming out tonight. I'm delighted that you're all here, and I'm Dan Rosenberg, the director of the Visiting Writers Series here at Wells. So welcome, and also welcome to people on the live stream over there. And thank you so much, Shane, and the IT crew for making it so that our audience from beyond Aurora can join us tonight via live stream. That's what you do. So how it's going to work tonight is I'll introduce Kiki Petrosino, who's going to come up and read, and then take your questions. We're going to have a conversation about her new book, right? And the many important and fascinating issues that it illuminates. But before that, I want to point out just a couple of things. Right? If you didn't already pick up your copy of Bright, it is our community read. So if you are a Wellsian and you did not get your copy, there are some on the table over there, and feel free to snag yours. And Kiki has been very kind to offer to sign people's books, and so that is a lovely thing for you. And I want to point out a cool thing that happened yesterday, because Kiki was available and she knew about our beautiful book art center, and we had made a broadside the last time she came to read it several years ago. And I said, do you want to make one together while you're here? And she did. And so we did a crazy thing yesterday. These are the sort of some of the process docs. You can see how bad we are at setting type. All of these circles are mistakes that we made. And then the check marks when we fix them. And then, you know, the next one probably shows more mistakes that we discovered that we made. You can see us figuring out like imposition and printing and like where, yeah, there's more mistakes that we missed. And so we went through it, we arrived with a sense of what text we wanted to make a broadside of. Then we were looking through the various cases of type available, and when Kiki saw that we had many cases of Dante type, she said, oh, that's the one, that's for me. And so we chose that, and what we ended up making was an edition of 50 broadsides of this excerpt from Bright, and they're all numbered and signed. It's an extraordinary thing when a poet like comes and sets their own work in metal type and makes a thing like this. And we have the facilities to do it, and we have had this incredible luck of Kiki and other like generous and exciting writers who are thrilled to have the opportunity to do it. And so these are here. They are, unlike the books, they're not entirely free, but they're available for $10, and that money goes into like basically recouping the cost of all the materials that we use to make the broadsides so that we can make the next round. And I just want to give a shout to Rob Lamascalo, who is our instructor in book arts, and the students in actually his bookbinding class, who decided that bookbinding can be understood very broadly to include letterpress printing so that we could work on this together. And it was really just a delightful thing. So those are available. Come talk to me if you would like one. Just come and check them out because they're beautiful and amazing. But if you'd like to buy one, I'm your man and I can do all the things. PayPal, Venmo, cash, favors, whatever. We're good. So those are my opening announcements, and now I get to introduce our visiting writer, Kiki Petrosino. So one of the students in my intro poetry workshop noted last week that in both of her recent books, Bright, her memoir, and White Blood, her fourth collection of poems, Kiki Petrosino adopts formal approaches that model a kind of obsession that refuses our 21st century impulse to ping quickly from datum to datum in favor of a slow building. In both books, meaning develops for us, for the readers, as Petrosino illuminates angle after angle on the same passage of text. In White Blood, that takes the form of an erasure project. She takes the same DNA ancestry results and erases different parts of the same text over and over to create different poems in a sequence using that same source material. And in Bright, for those of you who haven't read it to the end, toward the end there's this passage where page after page slowly adds one phrase after another to a growing fairy tale, each time creating a new ending that the next page will undo as ending by adding yet another phrase, right? And so it's the opposite of an erasure. It's an accrual of language that allows us, or requires us as readers, to read slower, to discover new relationships between the words. And I've been thinking about that feature of Petrosino's work ever since my student brought it up. I've been thinking about how it reflects a mind that's suspicious of easy, simple answers, that can't resist a great phrase, but can resist a pat idea. For example, in Bright, Petrosino refers to Shakespeare's Tempest often as a touchstone work for her. But in this exploration of her racial identity and heritages, she never mentions Caliban from that play. Caliban, the character who is the enslaved, dehumanized other, who countless critics have used as a metaphor for white anxiety about black men, never comes up, right? She doesn't do what would be obvious and therefore easy. In other registers as well, she doesn't recount particular cruelties that she's experienced as a mixed race woman. She doesn't invite the reader to be a voyeur in her struggles or pain. Instead, what this memoir offers us is a position as readers as a kind of thoughtful companion, like a Dante being guided by her Virgil, the Inferno being another touchstone. And we're accompanying her on a voyage of thinking through these issues of identity and history and language. Or maybe that's not quite right either, the thinking through part, because that suggests that you've come out on the other side. She's thinking into them, offering us not solutions, but empathy, not sound bites, but syllables. And Bright seems to me to be in clear conversation with another contemporary exploration of race in America. There's Claudia Rankine's Citizen. But Rankine's important book invites a kind of argument, right? Invites and models a kind of troubled and almost adversarial relationship to its material. And Petrosino's refuses argument in favor of worry. And I don't mean worry as in a feeling of anxiety or concern, even though that's certainly in here, right? But the other definitions of worry. She worries at the language, meaning to fiddle with it repeatedly. She worries out her language, meaning to try to solve it through persistent thought. And she worries the language, just straight up worries it as a transitive verb, meaning to tear at or drag it around with one's teeth. Those kinds of worry. Part of what makes Bright so powerful is that all this worrying makes it live on, not in that part of us that wants to have a debate or, God forbid, tell us that we're good, that we're not part of the problem. Instead, it lives deeper in that lonely core of us that waits, alone in stillness, to experience new language and new ways of being. I almost said there the deep heart's core, which is a line from Yeats, who also said this: "We make out of the quarrels with others rhetoric, but of the quarrels with ourselves poetry." Unlike the rhetoricians who get a confident voice from remembering the crowd they have won or may win, we sing amid our uncertainty. And smitten even in the presence of the most high beauty by the knowledge of our solitude, our rhythm shudders. Did I just claim that this memoir is poems? I've been teasing Kiki for the past couple of days about that very question. Let's agree to blame Yeats and note that Petrosino's writing is always going to be called poetry because it's beautiful, because it's surprising, because it finds its way inside us not just as a seeping idea or a narrative, but as a quiet voice, inviting us to be different, maybe even to be better to others and to ourselves. In addition to Bright, Petrosino is the author of 4 collections of poetry, including most recently White Blood, Lyric of Virginia. She directs the creative writing program at the University of Virginia, where she's a professor of poetry. She's the recipient of the Pushcart Prize, a fellowship from the National Endowment for the Arts, the UNT Rilke Prize, the Spalding Prize, and many other honors. and we're delighted to have her here to read from her memoir and talk with us about it. So please join me in welcoming Kiki Petrosino.
Will this water stay on here?
There's a shelf on there.
Okay.
And the podium. Is it too big for the shelf? How about the table over there?
Okay, thank you. Thank you, hello, everyone. It's wonderful to be here, and Dan, thank you for that wonderful introduction, which is really hard to follow, actually. So I will do my best here. Thanks everybody for welcoming me to Wells. This is my second visit, and every time that I come here, I'm so impressed and struck by the friendliness and the welcoming atmosphere that is here, by the fact that you are so friendly, and that you're so engaged with all of your studies, not just literature, English, poetry, but in all the things that make your intellectual life so astonishing to witness. And that act of witness is what I think is at the core of what fascinates me about teaching, or what I'm enjoying about teaching right now, is to witness the growth of all of my students. So thank you for showing me all of that. So I am going to read from some sections of this memoir, Bright. I'm going to read from the opening, and then I'll take a pause, and I might, skip around. This is a memoir that is composed in lyric fragments of prose. And you'll see there are some pretty straightforward aspects of narrative to it, but then there are some associative leaps that I invite the reader to make with me, especially into the realm of fairy tale and storytelling. After I get through the opening section, I'm going to get into some of the innards of this memoir. And I just wanted to let anyone know who might be sensitive to this topic that I am going to read some sections that contend with the suicide of my grandfather, which happened during the time that I was an undergraduate at the University of Virginia. And so that event is not depicted in any kind of graphic way, but the reality of it is part of the memoir, and so impossible to extricate. I'll give you a little bit of a heads up if there is anyone who would like a forewarning of when that part is going to come up. Water. The mirror. You don't need white people's approval to be happy, the mirror said. But if you want anything from their world, they have to like you. Bright is an American slang term for light-skinned people of black and white ancestry. It's not a compliment. From an early age, I understood how bright applies to me, to my skin, to the face I show the world. I'm fair for a black girl, powdery pale, especially in winter. It's hard to love bright, the sly, knowing way its lone syllable sidles up. Bright gets too close too soon, thinking it knows all about me. To be frank, there's a mean smile in the word. Light, bright, and damn near white goes the rhyme. Fuck those light brights, goes another. As soon as I enter the classroom, as soon as I put my books on the lectern, as soon as I begin speaking, those who don't like bright don't like me, and I can feel it. So what? I was born in 1979 in Baltimore City to a black mother and Italian-American father. As Catholics, my mother having converted before my birth, they sent my sister and me to parochial schools. At Immaculate Conception School in Baltimore, I turned the pages of a picture book about ladybugs beneath a bower of white gold honeysuckle. Some of the older girls taught me how to draw a single drop of nectar from the stem's fine filament and place it on my tongue. Part of my brightness begins this way. In the mid-1980s, we moved to Shrewsbury, Pennsylvania, then a small, nearly all-white town just north of the Maryland line. My parents built our new house in a development carved from seemingly endless farmland. Instead of a garage, they added an extra family room to our 3-bedroom ranch house with its gray aluminum siding and burgundy shutters. It was to be a house for sleepovers and summer barbecues, for holiday parties lasting far past bedtime. For months after we moved in, the house smelled like plaster, paint, the sharpness of fresh earth. My parents loved southern Pennsylvania, its clear air, its country charm. It must have felt to them like an escape from the city. On weekends, they bought Amish potato rolls from the farmer's market and took us to nearby Dutch Wonderland, an amusement park composed entirely of kiddie rides. What I remember, how the house spread horizontally across our quarter acre while everything in Baltimore had been stacked high and close. Most of our neighbors in Shrewsbury were Catholic. We saw no other Black or interracial families. Our brightness was new here. Here's how the plan for our family worked. Each weekday morning, my parents got into the family car and commuted an hour from Shrewsbury back down to Baltimore to teach in the city schools. My sister and I, in matching plaid uniforms, our braids tight on either side of our heads, took the bus in the opposite direction to a small Catholic school where we were 2 of the only Black students in the building. On the bus, we often held hands, even across the aisle, only unclasping when another kid boarded. From the bus windows, I would watch the dawn mist, its huge angelic presence, rising from rural fields of green and manure black. The barns we passed along the road were decorated with the stylized goldfinches, rosettes, and pineapples of the Pennsylvania Dutch. What it meant: abundance, welcome, good luck. When I first heard the name Pennsylvania, I imagined we were moving to a house made of pencils. We ended up in a suburb just emerging from rural landscape. Our street had no sidewalks, no parks or green space, only concrete gutters leading to storm drains, each one stained orange with clay. Neighbor to neighbor in this suburb, we glimpsed each other mostly through car windows on our silent collective way to elsewhere: groceries, church, the mall. On summer nights, I could discern the promise of rain as if it were a feeling inside my body. Secretly, I would open my bedroom window, touching my tongue to the metal screen. Crabgrass and vetch spread over the backyard, like fists clenching and opening. When he visited the ranch house that first year, my Italian grandfather spent the hours breaking up the stubborn clumps of reddish soil, heaving a pick over his head and bringing it down for marigold beds. Only reluctantly did the earth accept what we planted. Okay, now I'll skip ahead a little bit. And it is in these sections that I will read and that you'll find out a little bit that it will have a brief mention of my grandfather's passing, but really it's mostly about how I was able to deal with that situation. The wish. No sooner had she whistled than she felt her brightness rushing in from all sides, and such an assembly of brightness shimmered down that it stunned all the meadow in which it settled. Lately, I've been thinking about tenderness, how I wish it would break over me like a spirit of air. In Shakespeare's The Tempest, it's Ariel who warns the sorcerer Prospero that he must relinquish his anger. In the world of the play, Ariel has no form. He's a nexus of language and feeling, the invisible arpeggio of a hummingbird's wing. Ariel dips the ship full of Prospero's enemies beneath the ocean waves. He frightens the shipwrecked crew with eerie voices and visions that scatter them across the island. Easy games for a spirit. Yet, Ariel insists, if Prospero only allowed himself to see his enemies' sorrowful faces and hear their cries, your affections would become tender. Prospero is intrigued at this. Dost thou think so, spirit? Mine would, Ariel says, were I human. My teacher Gregory Orr wrote in Poetry as Survival, even as we recognize the power of disorder in our experience, We are likely to become aware of a strong need we have to feel there is some order in the world that helps us feel safe and secure. Can belief once planted ever fail to attach itself to some elemental source? Christ has died. Christ is risen. Christ will come again. The Old English poets sang in communal halls, sharing lines of alliterative verse. Repetition was meant to aid memory, but it also made the poems like Beowulf beautiful. I love this beauty. Ariel has no body. Ariel has nobody except for Prospero. Only the sorcerer, arriving bruised and banished from Milan, rescues Ariel from the cloven pine where he was imprisoned by an evil witch. Ariel has no body. Confinement tortures him inside the pine. Those branches, so like human arms upstretched, forked with pain. Prospero tells him, "Thou didst vent thy groans as fast as mill wheels strike." My Italian grandfather's name, Prospero. He was magical, just like the Duke of Milan, though born much further south in a stony village at the ankle of the Italian boot. In America, Prospero gardened. He planted Sweet William and Portulaca, moss roses in our backyard, tiny velvety flowers that unlatched from dark green buds. Having grown up in Italy, his script was calligraphic and antique, his numerals swooping rightward, his letter S transforming into a musical curve. In the only letter he wrote me, just as I set off for the University of Virginia, Prospero warned me against walking alone. I malviventi ci sono dappertutto. Evil ones are everywhere. One Tuesday morning, in the 10th decade of his life, Prospero hanged himself on the back of a door. Years later, while unpacking books in my new house in Virginia, my mother finds this line by Sarah Manguzo. One must be able to empathize with a suicide, yet not become one. What Prospero did is considered a gravely evil choice in Catholic tradition. For many years, I didn't tell his story. I couldn't think of him as a wrongdoer, un malvivente. At the funeral, as I watched the priest wreathe his casket in long strands of incense, I seemed a visitor at some ancient ceremony. My affections refused to become tender. I lost the letter. The spell. She rubbed her eyes and wept until the world looked blue. In the 13th canto of Inferno, the anonymous Florentine suicide weeps before Dante. The soul of the suicide has become a thorn tree. When Dante breaks off a twig, its speech gushes forth in jets of words and blood. Io fegibetto a me delle mie case. Here is a shade of stifled grief, confined within cells of bark and wood. I recognize these trees, I malviventi, ink black, lifting their brittle limbs from the soil. I made my house into my gallows. Out of love, Dante gathers up the suicide's twisted branches and all its black leaves, which grow no flowers. Someday, I'll tell you of the hours I spent with Inferno in my hands, searching again for that thorn tree. I'll break my staff. I'll drown my book. I'll skip ahead a little bit further. I'll read a couple more sections that have to do with the wood, also because it gives me an excuse to speak Italian, so you get, I just have to. I never get a chance to, which is why I put like these little Italian sections in the wood of the suicides in Dante is a forest of flesh, the only place like it in all Inferno. It breathes and bleeds. Having murdered themselves, having tried violently to separate body from soul, each suicide is flung upon the soil of the wood, where it fastens like a seed. After the funeral, I went back to school in Virginia. At a discount salon in Charlottesville, I had all my hair buzzed to 1/4 of an inch. I liked how hot the top of my head always felt now when I pressed my palm against it, how sharp the bristles of my natural hair, too short for curling irons and relaxers. In Italian, you don't turn off the light, you close it, only to open the light again in the morning. In describing the bewildering sounds of the wood, the pilgrim Dante appears to stammer with astonishment, but the careful music of his terza rima never fails. Credio che credete che io credesse, che tante voci ucciser, tra quei bronchi da gente che per noi si nascondesse. The C and S sounds make a series of sonic knots, like howls and yelps twisting into one cry. I go back over the passage as I once prayed in my rosary beads, pronouncing the syllables one by one in their original order. Years later, at the train station in Naples, my cousin greets me by first imitating Prospero's voice. My skull expands in recognition of the sound, calvarium per mandible, as if my bones were held together with golden pins. Sunlight opens above me, and I decide to stay. Okay, and now I'll read the final section of this book, which, as you've seen, and as Dan told you, is kind of like a cumulatively building fairy tale. And I wrote this part of the book in response to my editor asking me more about what the meaning of brightness is. Of course, it has this slang meaning, it has this cultural meaning. But also, my editor was like, what does explain the differences in people's skin tones? Is there a scientific reason that someone might be born with a different skin tone from someone else? And I did look up some of the science, but you know what? I'm not a scientist. And the conclusion that I ended up gathering from what I was reading is that there's quite a bit of random chance. It's like you put these chromosomes next to these chromosomes, and like there's probabilities, but actually, you know, you're a combination of these like ancestral genes, and it's kind of up to the genes to decide what exactly the outcome will be, which I think is really beautiful and like way cooler than having an actual scientific explanation. Okay. Once upon a time, two people wished to grow their family, so they sent copies of their chromosomes into the deep, dark forest. There, in a clearing, their child began to take shape, her limbs and organs following the contours of each ancestral gene. Certain proteins switched on, while others subsided. The world named one parent black and the other white, but neither set of genes originated in just one earthly place. This was a secret the child's body remembered. The world forgot. In each of her cells, continents merged and drifted. Ancestor, child, ancestor. More than 20,000 ancient stars deliberated on the child's gifts before settling at last on all she would carry. Thank you.
We have time for plenty of questions, and let's just open it up to folks. Questions, comments, things that you wanted to discuss.
I would love to hear you talk more about the form and what that means to you and how that kind of took form.
Yeah. So when I originally pitched this project to my editor Sarah Gorham at Saraband, I pitched a much more researched, I guess, conventional work of personal narrative. And for several years prior to making my book proposal, I had been writing the occasional essay. But I did not call myself an essayist. Why? Because writing prose was kind of excruciating. Not that poetry poetry doesn't have its perils, but I kind of know how to navigate them as a poet, whereas writing a piece of autobiographical prose felt very vulnerable and weird all of a sudden. So I would only write the occasional essay. And so what I kind of wanted to do was write, my version of, an autobiographical work, a memoir. But I also wanted to do a whole bunch of research and think more about my ancestry and kind of like make a prose companion to this book of poetry that I had written prior that involved a lot of research. Then the pandemic happened, and all of the archives that I wanted to visit closed, and I found myself spending like a year and a half to 2 years like not really leaving my house, but then also making the decision to actually move like during the pandemic. And so what I had with me were not necessarily like these like brand new researched materials, but what I had always was my questions and my obsessions and like the pieces of literature that I remember being important to me. And so what I kind of was able to do was kind of like break apart some of those prior essays and like write bridges to connect the parts. And then I started to become really interested and intrigued in this very short like vignette kind of form, which of course like might connect to my interest as primarily a lyric poet, but it was propulsive and generative, and it like made me happy to write this work. I also felt that there were changes that happened to my like attention span and to like the amount of time that I could actually be working on writing during the pandemic, and I felt like I couldn't imagine writing, like I couldn't imagine like covering a whole computer page with text and then like going to the next page and having it be blank and having to cover that with text. But what I could do is I could write a few lines, or I could work on these paragraphs, and I could go from like almost like from island to island or something in the work, but I didn't really know what was going to happen. But I was able to kind of like weave together fragments in order to kind of create that. That's actually a metaphor that I talked about my teacher, Greg Orr, here. In Poetry as Survival, he talks about, he has this metaphor of like a raft of poetry that like actually language like weaves together this like raft, and you as the human being who's like dealing with struggle climb aboard this raft of language, and that's actually like the purpose of poetry is to like help you, weather all of these like challenges, which for me also included the challenge of writing during this like very intense and strange period of time that we've all just experienced. Good question.
Thank you. That was so beautiful. I'm one of the people who still needs to pick up my copy, but I can't wait to read the rest. But I think I have a related question. Well, first of all, I just like to really appreciate what you just said about finding spaces in the midst of the pandemic, or sort of the limitations of the pandemic, and how they became generative spaces or spaces of possibility for you in the writing of this book. And I think I also have a question related to form, but I'm thinking about the conversation that you had in response to Dan's beautiful introduction at the beginning, where he was like, this is sort of a poem, and you said, no, this is lyric prose. And I know that was all very funny and charming, but also like I am actually curious about your thought about where that line is for you and how you think about those terms and how they might be productive for you, thinking about like the line between poetry and prose, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I feel like there isn't really a line, and when I try to think of like how I would talk about it, I wouldn't even describe it as a spectrum either, because that's also linear, if you think about that as a metaphor. I think that it's always the same mind and the same imagination that is kind of like worrying the material, and so whether you are writing a poem or you're writing a song or it's a screenplay or something like that, like some of these same themes and motifs just will come up for you, and it's interesting to pay attention to those things. kind of track them in your own writing. That's kind of why it's good to take courses like a creative writing workshop with Dan and colleagues, or even to work on another art form such as studio art that involves some kind of critique where you're actually like sharing the work and hearing from other people what they're seeing in the work. Because once you see it, then you cannot unsee it, and then you can start tracking it, you know? So what I'm interested in is like my liberation. I'm interested in like expanding my writing practice to incorporate all different kinds of like forms and modes, you know? And I also have had to accept that I'm not the same kind of writer as some of the essays that I admire, you know? Like I could read like a Rebecca Solnit essay. I could just read essay after essay, or a Joan Didion, or something like that. Or my good friend Leslie Jameson, you know? I can read, I really, really, really admire their writing, and like I would like to be just like them. However, I have my own voice as a writer, and I have my own forms that I like to work with. And this project allowed me to be able to hear that voice a little bit and like it, and be like, I will keep this, and I'll keep working on it, you know.
I was wondering, in the course of your research or in writing the memoir, if there were like surprising synchronicities or coincidences between your African American, Italian American, or African Italian heritage, and like surprises that you found in research that forged some connections in your own identity?
Yeah, I've actually been thinking about that a whole lot. For me, a lot of things come down to literacy. Like I've been thinking about what literacy means. I used to just think that it meant reading, being able to read and write. But I realized that there's all these other forms of literacy, and there's cultural literacy, you know, and there's disciplinary. It depends on what kind of discipline you're looking at. Like, can you cross genres? Can you read like a scientific paper, and then also read like a historical document, and then also read something that's in another language? Like all those things activate different areas of your literacy. So when I think about like the various aspects of my inherited identity, where do those things show up? And they kind of show up, or I have cultivated a literacy that tries to make a space and a container for all of those kinds of things, so that I can be able to ask questions at the Historical Society in rural Virginia, but then I can also go to Italy and like participate in like family events or something there, or understand, you know, I could read like during the pandemic, I could like read the like proclamations in Italian that were coming out in Italy, because they were like a little bit further ahead in the pandemic than we were. And so I was like able to try to activate some of that literacy across different things. So for me, it's even maybe more complex than just talking about like overlap and synchronicity. To me, it's like very much about like amplitude, you know? It's like, I just want to keep expanding in my literacy, so that I can put arms around like all of the things that are a part of my identity, and not just to then celebrate that or something, but to also say like, it means something to have this literacy. And like when I turn it outward towards the world, what can I do with that like perspective? You know, how can you fine tune that instrument? But basically, I think that one area of overlap is just the idea of diaspora, you know, and different kinds of diaspora. There's of course the African diaspora, which I, you know, descend from, but then there's also like the diaspora that comes about because of immigration.
So yeah, first thank you for coming, but you know, having read Inferno and the rest of the comedy, I think I was hesitant to ascribe personal meaning that could reflect my own life, knowing that like Dante could have never imagined the atmosphere of like a Black Baptist church or something similar. And so I was curious about whether isolated from like the white authors that inspire you, or even if it's like possible to write about Blackness without it being influenced by like those same white authors, knowing that some Black poets and artists are scared of their work being bastardized or co-opted.
What do you mean by that last part?
Yeah, like, I think specific, like Jeremy O'Hara's piece, like, I think that maybe some Black poets that I've read are always sort of hesitant to write about the authors or seem they're inspired by that, and so.
I see, okay, yeah.
Parts of their work.
Yeah.
They're multiple isolated.
Yeah, okay, so I've also been thinking a whole lot about that. It's complicated though, and again, it goes back to literacy, because it's like, how did I learn to read, and what was I reading? What were the readings and texts that came to me during formative times? Not that my formative times are over, but like, what are these texts that I keep going back to? And it's like, Shakespeare's The Tempest and Divine Comedy are just two things that I tend to go back to. Not because I'm reading them for evidence of Blackness or something like that, but because the writing that I wanted to write about, the writing that I wanted to do was like, how do I talk about this time in my life, which was, for me, my undergraduate years. That Shakespeare play and all of that Dante material, I was reading it more or less at the same time during my undergrad year, because I majored in English and minored in Italian. And then I experienced this devastating loss in my family. But I still had all this homework to do. And so you open the book up and it's like Canto 13 of Inferno, and it's dealing with this circumstance, right? And for me also, in thinking about Dante, I also have to remember the fact that I was raised as a Roman Catholic and went to Catholic schools. So my literacy formed around predominantly white institutions, a predominantly white church, and predominantly white living situation. But with that, okay, so that was all happening, but then I also have a mother who's African American from DC. She went to an HBCU, Hampton. Also my grandfather and great-grandfather all went to Hampton, right? I went to the University of Virginia, not because I didn't want to go to Hampton, but because I was actually the first generation of my family who could go to UVA as a woman and a Black woman. UVA integrated rather late, and it welcomed women rather late, right? So generationally in my family, it's the first time that a Black woman in my family could have gone to UVA, right? So some of the stuff is just circumstantial, you know? And I think that part of my literacy has been also, as an adult, becoming literate and really understanding where my work can resonate with the work that African American poets are doing. In terms of my own reading currently, I'm reading work almost exclusively by people of color who are dealing with a ton of cross-cultural and cross-disciplinary issues. And many of them are conducting research and thinking about this exact nexus of what does it mean to claim African American identity in the midst of all of these systems, including educational systems, including religious and cultural systems that aren't necessarily, that were not made for us at the level of the architecture of those systems, but that we live in. You have to be able, people talk about it as code switching, but it's sort of like you have to be able to flow everywhere. And there's a lot of work that poets do who are poets of color. What I think of it as is opportunity, and I feel like it's a gift to be able to develop those different kinds of literacies.
A question about, so you've done a lot of research and you've gotten the documents and talked about that in master class. How do you preserve your own documents? What do you preserve? How do you even approach that?
I have not done a great job. A lot of it is just on my computer, right? So besides besides paying the 99 cents per month to like Apple, to like for the extra storage space, I try to basically create a system of like folders and file names that help me, that help me track like what my research is. There was a time earlier in my genealogical research where I was trying to do a bullet journal. It became excruciating to do a bullet journal. I felt like I could only do the beginning part of it, and then it was just too much pressure on me to like exist within the bullet journal like strictures. So I try to keep typed notes or handwritten notes. But in fact, what I would probably say is that the most coherent like document of my research is actually the like poetry and writing that emerges from it. And the other piece of that is like, since I'm not a historian and I'm not like going to be writing a scholarly paper, I can give myself a little bit of permission to keep my records in a different way. Like if I'm an artist, it's really about gathering the materials for inspiration to be able to be in a position to write my work, to like make work. And so the way that I might store my information will necessarily be different from the way that somebody in law school is going to be like keeping track of their information.
Maybe when you were naming each chapter in the book, was it like on purpose to like for me each chapter kind of reminded me of a princess story,
Yeah.
like a Cinderella story. Was that on purpose or?
Yes. Yeah, it was pretty much on purpose. Those little brief fairy tale interludes are inspired in part by a collection of Norse fairy tales called East of the Sun, West of the Moon, and specifically an edition that was illustrated by Kay Nielsen. And some of those illustrations are like iconic or something. They really, when you think about those illustrations, when you think about those stories are about like, white bears who just show up at the door of the house like one day and start talking and take people away. Like the wind speaks and gives you directions to the next castle. And the thing about those particular fairy tales, I think maybe in contrast to something like Grimm's fairy tales, is like in the edition that I read of East of the Sun, West of the Moon, there's a lot of like chaining together of narrative elements using really simple, I guess you would say, conjunctions or other types of like those small linking pieces of grammar, so that it would be like and, right? Or it would be like so. And this fantastical tale is being spun. I mean, there's like, there's like keys and cottages and maidens and swans and a bear and like all these things happening, and you have to hold it all in your mind, and it doesn't feel linear and rational. It feels fantastical and kind of amazing. It feels like this adventure, and that's kind of like my sense of like what has it been like to understand my identity and my own heritage. It's not a story that you can start with anything else but because it also feels like it's a part of a story that's still happening and still going on,
So I'm curious about the way in which loss is so central, and what you've done with it is you've produced something, and how you think that might be related to the various versions of Catholicism that pop up here, or religion more broadly.
Yeah. Yes. Well, I think that the religion in which I can only speak about my own experience of religion. It gives you a structure for processing aspects of our shared humanity that would be difficult, if not impossible, to process and heal and move on from on your own. So there's a liturgy, and you move through the liturgy. There's like a requiem mass that is said for the dead, and like there's like this process, right? But it also leaves a lot out. It leaves a lot of the uniqueness of the person out. only certain places where you can fit memory into the ritual, and then you're kind of left after the ritual is over to process even more, to think about stuff that even more that the communal experience of the religious observation can't include by its nature. And also, like, what happens when somebody that is in your family passes away, and their method of passing away is something that the church has a taboo about. All of a sudden, certain structures are now unavailable to you, for the family. And I have thoughts about that. And that was in part some of our family's experience. And so there has to be, for me, a place to like grieve for the whole person, and to think about the value and the wonder that was and is my grandfather's memory, apart from that moment of his passing, which for me is so separate from, I think, the core of like the memory of that I have of him. I also just want to say that like for 20 years I didn't discuss this. I didn't write about it, and I was an undergraduate and I didn't tell anyone. So that wasn't like the most healthy choice. I wish that if I could go back in time, I would have tried to seek out some support systems and some help to be able to process that grief. But I also think that this is a book that I couldn't have written at that time. Like, I kind of had to live those 20 years and come to terms with that grief and reclaim the memory of my grandfather's legacy, so that I could then write about it.
I have two questions. The first one was, did you learn why your grandfather committed suicide? And if you did it help you or not?
I mean, there wasn't like one reason, and it was very, I think, to me it came across as unusual because I had never heard of someone passing away in that way at the age of 90, which he was 90. And so what I think was going on is that he was suffering health setbacks, and I feel like he just couldn't, I feel like he was overwhelmed by those things. And he had always been a very physically robust person, and he would always like walk. He was like the old Italian guy that was taking his daily constitutional, around going to the Pathmark, right? And back in Brooklyn. And so when he couldn't do those things that he was used to doing, I don't think that he could deal with it. And I think that he didn't have the support, and probably didn't even know how to even seek out some help for those things. And so unfortunately depression and those things can happen to people. And so when I think about the reason, I think that's the closest I can approach. Yeah.
My second question is, do you feel that speaking Italian being in your ear, does it impact your writing, your poem in English, your poetry? And if it affects it, in which way?
I think that it like reinforces the importance of a musical sensibility to my poetry. In high school, I took French because there was no Italian offered in my high school. Then when I got to UVA, there were all these other languages too, and having learned French for several years before helped me learn Italian. So then it's like I realized that I was learning as much with my ear as with any intellectual force. And so because I was studying Italian and I was like studying English, there were these times when I was reading like Petrarch in two languages, looking at Dante in two languages. And so it became like this speaker on either side of my head of English and Italian and so many of the same ideas being discussed. And And so sound and tone and intonation are always important to my poetry, and I really like repetition and incantatory structures and going back to some of the same passages to find new music in them. So that's why one of the things that I'm always happy about is like to be able to have even a limited amount of literacy in another language, to have access to even a tiny bit of another language. I only wish that I had another language as a mother tongue, like English, but I'll have to just do my best with English. But having the experience of learning another language has been like so enriching for me as an artist.
It sounds like your grandfather was more euthanasia than suicide in a way. Do you see it only as a suicide, or because of wanting to end it, with dignity or whatever?
Yeah, I think that he stayed as long as he could. I think that's kind of how the closest I can come to it. So when I remember him, I don't really remember that. I don't think all the time about that moment. I think about all the other things that he represented for me, and the things that he taught me, things that he said, jokes that he told, the sound of his voice, especially if he would speak Italian. He had a very deep, gravelly voice, which is why my cousin, like when I went to Naples to meet my family in Italy, first of all, I knew it was my cousin because he was like a very short Italian man who was exactly like all the men in my family. But then when he began speaking, he imitated my grandfather's voice like perfectly, and I was like, this is my family. And so that, for me, like he's like this thread throughout my life, and I started studying Italian because at that point he was still alive, and I wanted to be able to speak to him in his language, all these things are cool and interesting to me, and then I just try to cherish those memories. And then on the other side of it, it's like there are other ancestors whom I did not get to ever meet or get to know or get to share those things with, and so there's that sense of loss as well, which maybe is part of living in a diaspora, right? And so, there's this like give and take in these, and there's a constant tension between like what I once had but lost, questions that I didn't know how to ask but I'm asking now, presence and absence and distance and proximity,
May I ask a question? Just when you were Maria, on your mom's side, where did you have a chance of knowing more of your parents and grandparents?
Yes, I knew my grandparents. My grandfather, my African-American grandfather passed away when I was quite young, but my grandmother lived to be almost 100. And so I was able to have a really good relationship with her. And of course, my mother, I'm like probably the closest to her. I feel I'm the person who's the closest to me in the whole world, probably. Probably gonna text her tonight. And so I've been lucky and fortunate to enjoy the family relationships that I've had, and I wish that I had been able to ask certain questions and just get the info, or like learn more about some of those ancestral memories. But my research process is bringing me towards a version of some of those truths. So that would be my advice to any young writers here, is that when you have your parents and grandparents around, like listen and like write down everything they say, everything they tell you, and just really like cherish and keep all of that material and relationship.
Mindful of the time, we can continue chatting informally, but thank you, Kiki. I'll do a quick announcement here, right? Before we all wander off, just a quick reminder, If you did not pick up your copy of Bright, it is over there waiting for you. Broadsides are available for sale or perusal, just come check them out. And stay tuned, wherever you heard about tonight's reading, you will hear more about our next visiting writer, Ethan Young, who's coming October 18th to talk about his graphic novels, his work drawing comic book covers and other kinds of amazing art, and his experience designing characters for his own projects, and as a full-time character designer for Marvel Studios Animation. It will be fun and cool and interesting. I hope to see you then, and thank you all again for coming, and please join me for one more round of applause for Kiki.
Dan, you didn't mention